Howdy, folks. Great to be talking to you today. Many thanks to the Thinky Games team for organizing this conference for us. So let's talk about pitching your Thinky game. This talk is geared less towards providing detailed information on how to structure a game pitch. There's a lot of great resources out there, but this talk is instead geared more towards taking a step back and providing a framework to think through how to approach and structure your game project through the lens of pitching, and thinking about how to align the goals for your project with what you're creating. All right, so first things first, who am I? Why should my perspective on this topic be exciting and relevant to you? So I'm Rachel Heleva. I'm the biz dev and scouting manager at Astrological. We're a newer publisher and once nonprofit fund that exclusively publishes Thinky games. And for the last couple of years, I've been managing our process for sourcing and signing games. And so I've looked at thousands of Thinky games through the lens of sourcing at Astra, as well as through our fellowship selection program, supporting the New Voices grant program. And I've also helped with various curation groups like the IGF Awards and also the Thinky Awards. So have a sense of things that aren't just important commercially, but critically when someone's looking at a Thinky project. What are the things that really matter? Okay, and before we get started on thinking about how to pitch a Thinky game, I feel like we have to also take a step back and clarify what we mean by Thinky. Even though we're at ThinkyCon right now, one can never be too clear about what they mean when they use the term. So when I'm using this term and when Astra is using this term, we're referring to games that embody certain design principles and where logical reasoning is centered in the moment-to-moment gameplay experience. So the core principles that I'm talking about when I'm talking about Thinky games is this sense of progressive complexity that leads to mastery. All of the games that I'm going to be discussing are games that have a gradual learning curve where players are asked to master increasingly challenging problems. So not just logic-driven games or soccer band games, but also Thinky deck builders, Thinky tactics games, Thinky management games. And another important principle that all of these games have is they have clear transparency of information where they're giving the players the tools and clarity that's needed to engage with them so that players are reasoning through problems rather than using guessing and chance. And another important property that I'm referring to when I'm talking about Thinky games is that all of these games have some element of emergent thinking. So players are not just, solving simple problems through the game. They're using evolving strategies and play styles through the introduction of new tools, mechanics, and systems that cause a player to interact with the game in a new way or go deeper as they play. Okay, so in my line of work, I talk to a lot of developers, ranging from hobbyists to professionals, developers that are brainstorming to developers that are actively pitching their games to me, and so on. And there's no right way to make a game, and there's no right sort of game to make. But something that I do often see in my line of work is developers having goals that are misaligned with what they're trying to create. And that can cause a lot of confusion for a developer who's wondering, why am I struggling in the pitching process? Or even for a developer who doesn't want to pitch their game, they just want to make something cool and interesting. They might be struggling and wondering, why am I not able to get people to play my game? Or why am I struggling to find popularity on certain sites? And so I think it can be really important to know what your goals are as a developer and what you want to achieve with your project, and make sure that's being represented in your design and project choices. Because you could be approaching this from a lot of different angles. Maybe you're someone that just wants to make a game that explores an idea that's interesting to you. And you're not very concerned about having commercial upside from the project. Maybe you're a solo developer that wants to put a really cool idea out there and you don't want to work with a publisher, and it's okay if your game doesn't have like a strong return for you because you just want to be able to make your next game that explores an interesting idea. That's a great angle to be approaching your work from, and you can kind of take more risks. You can be in a riskier subgenre, or you can have a different focus. But if you want to make a game that has commercial appeal and potentially find a publishing partner or platform interest, then you should probably be approaching your project from a different angle, maybe thinking a bit more critically about the unique properties of your game or what subgenre you're working in, or even things like your aesthetic. And then if you want to go a step further than that and you have big, lofty ambitions of making a game that has really targeted commercial appeal and the potential to reach really big, broad audiences, then you would want to think about your work and from a deeper angle of, okay, how do I make this experience really engaging overall? And I think, so as you're thinking about your goals, you're thinking about what you want to do with your project, it's important to try to gut check your assumptions about how certain games do or what's possible in certain spaces. It can be really easy, especially if you're deep in the Thinky community, for example, you know certain games really well, and those games might be highly revered in your community. And so you might have certain assumptions about what's possible in a given space. It can be really fun to actually try to gut check those assumptions using publicly available data. So what you see here, I've used sites like Video Game Insights or SteamDB. I currently use Game Discover Co. a lot. It's a paid site though, so it's a little less accessible. SteamDB, you can just get like a plugin for your computer. But as you're starting to think about, what your goals for your project are and the space you want to work in and the things you want to try, it can be nice to go and check some of the games that are similar to the project you want to make and just see, okay, how did those games do and what's possible? And sometimes you might be surprised. Maybe a game that you were underestimating did better than you thought, or maybe a game that you're very familiar with and you hold in very high regard maybe didn't sell as many copies as you would have thought. And there's something interesting to reflect on there. And so as you're, going through the process of thinking about what your goals are for your project and then looking at similar games out there and kind of going through those steps of gut checking your assumptions, it can also be really nice to try to understand the landscape overall for your project. Different subgenres have different floors and different ceilings for success. Typically, you want to be in a subgenre where the demand is higher than the supply of games out there. So you'll see in some subgenres to the right end of this top chart, puzzle, for example, there's a lot of puzzle games out there. And this is just using the broad tag puzzle on Steam. There's a lot of puzzle games and there's not as many people playing those games. You'll see something very similar with the platformer subgenre. Okay, there's a lot of platformers out there. There's not as many people playing those types of games. If you look at the left side of the chart, you'll see okay, there's a lot of people that want to play city builders. There's not quite as many city builders out there, and so on for deck builders. And I'm not saying this to say, hey, you should only make games in subgenres where more people are looking for games than there are games out there. But I think it can be a helpful framing to just understand whether you want to make a commercial game or not, but especially if you are making a commercial game, what the landscape is like, what you're going up against. And then if we try to just hone in on the performance of what are the key Thinky subgenres, what is the opportunity space for me as someone who wants to make a Thinky game? I I didn't really break down all the different thinky subgenres. There's so many of them. There's so many takeaways and things we could talk about, but I think there are three in particular that are really interesting to me to think about. Pure puzzle is one where I see a lot of folks from the Thinky community wanting to make games in that space. And one interesting thing, just thinking about like pure puzzle games overall, it can be a difficult subgenre to stand out in. You know, we all there's a lot of puzzle games coming out, and it can be difficult when puzzle games have complex rule sets that can't be easily understood if it's being shown on a YouTube stream or a Twitch stream. Games like Viewfinder or Portal stream really nicely because they have these simple rule sets that I can easily understand in a GIF. So just thinking about, okay, if I'm approaching that space, how can a puzzle game be explained and understood in order to stand out in a space that has a lot of games in it and players have a lot of choice? How can I make sure players look at my game and understand exactly what they're going to be getting? And then talking about a different type of thinky subgenre, deck builders. I think deck builders is a really interesting space to be experimenting and making a project in. It's really strong, especially like looking at recent releases like Cobalt Core. I just think there's a lot of opportunity to play with this set of mechanics of roguelike deck building and infusing things like tactics into them. And it's a space where if you are trying to make a commercial project, you have a greater chance at finding an audience. And then a thinky subgenre that I honestly just love to see more games in is the programming subgenre. There's some really big successes in programming games like Opus Magnum or Human Resource Machine, but there's not that many people making games in the space. So I think, you know, it's definitely a difficult type of design to approach, but the more I'd love to see more folks trying to experiment with programming games. Okay, so we've talked about thinking about what your goals are as someone designing and pitching a thinky game, thinking about what the landscape for games is like overall, and then thinking about the different types of thinky subgenres. So when you're going through the process of like, okay, I have a game, I'm ready to pitch it, really try to think about the subgenre that you are working in and what are the challenges of those subgenres, just to temper your own expectations or figure out, okay, how do I communicate what's unique about my game? Thinking about the detective subgenres in particular is just an example. If we look at the space, there's a lot of games that come out and do have breakaway success, but there's also just a lot of different games being released in this genre on Steam, meaning that it is hard to stand out, but those that bring a really unique mechanic or framing to the detective genre have a tendency to find a foothold with audiences. Return of the Obra Dinn, that's an older game, but really strong art style, really unique system. Strange Horticulture brings like the mechanics of Papers, Please into a cozy atmosphere in a way that's really stand out. But just kind of looking at the landscape, you can definitely get a sense of there's a sliding scale of opportunity. Some of these games sell a lot of copies, and then the further you like go down in the range, there's a lot of titles in the middle range, and then there's a lot of titles that, you know, come out and just have more moderate success and can struggle. Okay, so we've talked about understanding the landscape and reflecting on like the different opportunity spaces and what's possible. So now that we're thinking about just pitching our game, you definitely want to have a strong sense of what makes your game unique, no matter what subgenre you're working in. And it's important to have a really a bold art style or a unique mechanic to stand out. It's also important to try to have a unique twist on a system players are familiar with. Cobalt Core does this. It takes the roguelike deck building of something like Slay the Spire and infuses it with the tactics, grid-based tactics, in a way that's really fresh and interesting. Another way to stand out is to bring a new feature to a genre that makes it more appealing, or mashing up a genre. Against the Storm does this by bringing a roguelike structure to city building in a way that makes it possible to not have to sink 20 or 40 hours into a campaign just to experience the full gamut or range of mechanics in a city builder. Instead, you can have a 20-minute run where you get to dive in and see the impacts of managing a small city. And lastly, when you're pitching your game, no matter what subgenre you're targeting, you want to ask yourself, why would a player play your game? Consider what's missing from the subgenre you want to make your project in. Consider why someone would dedicate time to completing your game. If it isn't clear in your pitch why someone would finish your game, then they might not engage with it in the first place. An example like this in a puzzle game might be that I get to experience this really unique mechanic, and then something about it is going to change, and the way that I interact with the whole world is going to change. And if that's clued to me as a player before I play it, then I'll definitely want to stick around and play till the end, or that might be the reason why I buy the game in the first place. For a deck builder like Slay the Spire, there's a really clear point at which I get to say, I've demonstrated mastery over a system. I've experienced all the mechanics. Similar for a game like Factorio, I have this really clear goal on the horizon I get to work towards. I'm building all these production lines for the purpose of trying to create a rocket. And because of that, I have something that's pulling me to engage with the game in the first place and continue on in the experience. And you also want to understand what is important to or desired by certain game audiences. If you're making a Sokoban, then there's been a lot of entries into the genre, but if you're in the Thinky community, you are uniquely positioned to understand, what do people who play Sokoban games want to see? What would feel fresh? What's something no one's tried? And if you're trying to experiment with a new subgenre that you might not be as deep in the community of yourself or play as many games in, you can always try to go to the communities of people that play those games and figure out, what are the people who play these games constantly looking for? What do they want to see? I love going to different subreddits and just kind of looking at the things that players are constantly asking for in different communities. And yeah, so that's my talk on pitching your game. Just a recap, the thing to focus on here is, what are your goals for the game that you want to make? Do you want to explore an interesting idea? Do you want to try to make a commercial game or find a publishing partner? Are you trying to have a game with a large upside? And based on whatever your goals are, thinking about the subgenre that you're working in, the way that you're presenting and finding your mechanics, and the way that you're innovating within that space, to connect with players. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Rachel, so much. That was wonderful. Such great advice that many people definitely need to hear, and there's lots of appreciation for it in the chat as well. A few questions did come up, so we'll try and get to those now. A bit of time for questions. Video Space Games in the chat asked, would you tend to agree with the other talks? I think they're referring kind of to like Lenefe's talk and Zalavir's talk, where like redoing the framing of the thinky aspect might get broader market appeal.
Yeah, I think that you don't necessarily need to emphasize that your project is a cerebral game in order to hook players. I think sometimes it can feel important to emphasize, like, this game is really hard to get people to want to play it. But that's not necessarily the thing that, like, the fact that Factorio has a difficulty ceiling isn't the reason why people like to play it. People like to play Factorio because it's deep and complex and there's a lot of things to learn. And I think approaching it from that angle invites more people in. One of the most interesting discoveries I've made recently is that some people see Factorio as a cozy game. There's like a lot of chatter around Factorio in the cozy like subreddits. And I think when you take a step back and you don't find the need to frame your project as like aggressively thinky, you might be surprised who'd be excited to engage with it.
Fantastic answer, thank you. We also had a question, so it's from Mari that it kind of sounds like you maybe sort of answered it because I think the question was asked and then you went straight to a slide that sort of answered it. But I think there's still a good question there, which is super curious if you have any thoughts about the murder mystery / detective genre. Of course, you had a slide about it. But I guess the big question at the end was, are they difficult to pitch to thinky publishers?
I think that detective games, there's a lot of interest in detective games. And I think there are definitely publishers out there who are eager to explore the subgenre. It can be viewed as a difficult subgenre to find big success in. So that can be a reason why it might be harder to find a partner, just because depending on, the scale of like budget you need, it might be seen as, oh, a moderate bet is that a detective game will only do X amount, and it can be very easy for the amount that you need to be very close to that expected success level. I would definitely, if you're working on a detective game, just focus on what's unique about it and a unique art style, a unique presentation, because there's constant hunger for detective games. So
I think one of the key things to take away from your slides, from some of the charts, is that, like, looking at the numbers of sales that different games make, like, people have got to think about what the publisher is expecting this game to sell. It's not just about like
yes,
what do I want my game to sell. It's like
yeah,
publishers have
it can
expectations.
it can be really easy as a developer to think about your project from the lens of, this is what we're excited to make, this is what we're excited to explore, this is the size of our team, so these are the needs we have to support our team. And then you go to a publisher, you go around and try to talk to publishers, and it might be really confusing because wait, we've approached this in a way where the amount we're paying ourselves feels really fair. And that might be true, but from a publisher's perspective, if their goal is to see return on their investment that makes them be able to not just return the funding they've given, but continue to grow and support more games, they have to have reason to believe that that's possible. So definitely something to think about if your goal is to find a partner, get a certain level of funding.
Absolutely. We're getting a lot of questions through, actually. So the next one that came along, this might just be just a question about some of the numbers in the slide. Parabox tagged as having 95,000 copies and making $95,000.
Oh, there might have just been a typo there. If you want to use SteamDB, so the numbers I have I found using Game Discover Code, which just scrapes public information that's available on Steam. Game Discover Code does have a paywall, so I would recommend people use SteamDB, and it doesn't have quite as much information, but if you go there, you can get some sense of copies sold and things like that. And it's just really nice to go and double check. Oh, how many copies did this actually sell? I'm surprised constantly by how well some games have done, and then games that I am a huge fan of, I'll sometimes be really shocked to see. Wait, I would have assumed this deck builder did the same as others, but it actually did like a tenth as well as a medium-sized success.
There was a lot of shock for some of the numbers that you did show in the slides. Like, oh, that only made that many, that sold that many copies. Okay, next question. Do you think there are ways to frame a mild hook in a more appealing way, or fumble and frame a good hook in a bad way?
I definitely think people will sometimes struggle to actually communicate what makes their game unique. Uh, Oftentimes, I'll see pitches where people will focus a lot on here's how the overall system works, or here's what the mechanics are. But when you don't frame it in this is an interesting interaction I can have, and this is the impact that that interaction has on the overall experience. Like take the witness, I do these panel puzzles, and then I will start to have insights about the world overall and solve large world scale puzzles. That's a really interesting hook. If the game was just described as I'm just drawing lines, and these are all the different types of lines I can draw, that's not quite as interesting.
And that's funny because that is when somebody tries to describe that game who hasn't played it, they're just like, "Oh, you just draw lines, right?" That's basically the description, and I guess that
No.
shows that people can take that impression from seeing clips of a game like The Witness or whatever.
And that's why you shouldn't be worried about spoilers when you're showing off your games, because it doesn't actually like ruin an experience for a player to see a cool gif of, oh, I go through this portal and then this crazy thing happens. They just see it and they think it's cool. You as
Yeah.
the designer will always have more context on what it means, but people are going to forget by the time they play your game.
I think it's really fun to go back and watch trailers of games that you've already played, and you're like, "Oh, surely they won't show any spoilers." And there's always loads of spoilers throughout the trailer, and it's like because it helps people get interested in the game. All right, sorry, other questions. Gal Green has asked, you mentioned at the start that transparency of information is a core aspect of Thinky Games, right? In your opinion, how much RNG disqualifies a game from being considered Thinky? Any amount? Randomness.
It's definitely a sliding scale, right? Like there's some tactics games where randomness is a key factor. I think what's important is my ability to make predictions about what I can do heavily impacted by randomness. If I can't form any sort of strategy, then I'm not thinking, right? But if I can form a strategy and I can make reasonable predictions about what's going to occur, then I would consider a game thinky. And then there's definitely ranges of games that use less randomness. I can think more. But
Absolutely.
I wouldn't say any amount of randomness is a DQ.
Absolutely. All right. So Fahim here is asking, is that the next question? Yes. Are virtual slice/demos important for evaluating a Thinky game pitch? What do you look for in them, and does it differ based on subgenre, pure puzzle versus, say, detective games?
Whether or not you have a vertical slice or a playable demo is going to matter more depending on, have you released the game before? What sort of game have you released before? So if you're Yeppy Carlson, the Cocoon Limbo guy, like you don't really need a vertical slice or a demo. If you're a dev that's starting out, it's going to help you a lot to have one of those. And something I see a lot in playable demos is people will focus on having a lot of content in, just to show, oh, these are all the different things you're going to be able to do. These are all the different systems and mechanics. And usually that can feel like a bit of a waste, because what I'm looking for when I'm playing one of those is, what's an interesting choice I'm going to make? Or what's one interesting interaction? Like when these two mechanics happen at the same time, like what's the interesting thing I get to think through. I would focus more on a moment that really showcases like a meaningful insight or a meaningful choice someone has to make rather than having a ton of content in.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for the answers. Thank you again, Rachel, and see you all in a moment for the next talk. Thanks, Rachel.
See ya.